maybe there's one more thing that we would say about, I heard you mention that Paul knew, did you say James? But you don't accept James as being the brother of Christ, right?
Well, so that's a bit of a nuanced position there. Later on in Galatians, Paul does mention James the Pillar or James the Just, but the James that's mentioned in Galatians 1:19 is a completely different Christian that's just a baptized Christian. He calls him a brother of the Lord, but the problem with that is that that's too ambiguous to say that he was a blood brother, because the actual word there in Greek, adelphos, means both. That it could either be a blood brother or a fictive kinship. Since Paul hold on. Since Paul already has the concept of brothers in the Lord, and that every baptized Christian is therefore a brother or sister of Jesus Christ, then it makes that particular sentence right there ambiguous. And if he wanted to be clear about it, he could have said brother of the Lord in the flesh, which he does in other areas of his work when he wants to distinguish somebody that was of blood relative relation. That particular part, brother of the Lord, considering Paul's position on that particular title, seems to indicate that it was a fictive kinship rather than anything else.
Well, I tend to agree with Bart Ehrman in his debate with Robert Price, where he goes, well, no, he's specifically contrasting him with Cephas. And he talks about Cephas, and he mentions Cephas, and then he mentions and the brother of the Lord. So as Bart says, like he's contrasting those two. So if it's just like, well, he was, like a Christian, like a brother in Christ, he wouldn't have said Cephas and the brother of the Lord. And that,
Well, from what I understand of Greek, which again, I'm not an expert in Greek or anything like that, but what I understand from Greek is that the definite article there, while it's very meaningful to us, it was pretty common at the time to use a phrase in that way. Regardless of that, I do think that he's distinguishing Cephas from, or Cephas, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. He's definitely distinguishing Peter from this James. But where we differ is what you consider this James to be. Because I just consider him a normal baptized Christian, because that's coherent with the rest of Paul's theology and how he references other baptized Christians later on. Because you mentioned earlier about how you really liked Paul's theology, I guess, on taking a wife. In that particular section, he calls these wives sisters. So unless you want to go as far as to say that these other apostles were taking their literal sisters to be wives, then I think that it would behoove us to lean towards the fictive kinship.
Well, it's interesting, though, that you bring up, are you talking about 1 Corinthians 9:5 or 9, chapter 9?
I can't remember the exact verse, but it's where he's talking about like why, can we not bring our sisters, right, with us?
In 1 Corinthians 9:5, that in that same passage, he distinguishes Cephas and the other apostles from the Lord's brother. He says, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas?
Well, yes. And like I said before, that's still coherent with my position on it. Because
how is he? Go ahead.
Well, because he's separating out the different types of Christians that there are. There are apostles. Those are people that have received revelation of Jesus. And then there are common Christians, which could be brothers of the Lord, or brothers of the Lord could have been a special title where they were more than just a general baptized Christian, but they were still just Christians. It has nothing to do with being a blood relative of Jesus. Now, it is possible that they somehow secretly police that particular term to only refer to bloodkins of Jesus. But there's actually no evidence in history to suggest that it was being policed in such a way. So, like I said, taking brothers of the Lord as either a title for a certain kind of Christian is way more coherent with Paul's theology than accepting that brother of the Lord is only used to refer to a blood relative of Jesus, because the actual word used there, adelphos, means both. I mean, so let me ask you this. do you agree that brothers of the Lord, or this fictive kinship, was definitely a theology of Paul?
Yeah, so I believe that brother and sister in Christ is kind of used in that way, but the thing that differentiates it, and this is where I agree with Bart Ehrman, is when in the context he distinguishes people who would be brothers of the Lord, right, and the apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas. When he distinguishes between all these people in multiple verses and the Lord's brothers, I think Bart's right on this. I mean, I take his view. Now, I could be wrong, and go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, what considering the word that's used there, Paul's theology, what is the definite evidence that proves that I'm wrong about how brothers of the Lord is used?
So this is what Bart says, right? And he teaches Greek. He obviously, he says there's two different ways to think about this. There's the way that you say, oh, it's my Jewish brother or my Christian brother, my brother in the Lord, or my sister in the Lord. And then there's my blood relative, my brother. And he says, when you look at this, if in either of these verses, he were to just say that he would just be using kind of like the fictitious kinship or like my brother in the Lord, he wouldn't have been distinguishing between fellow followers of Christ. In fact, like if you look at other passages where some of the ways that we know, like that Luke was a Gentile, is like Paul will talk about my fellow workers of the circumcision, right? And then he'll talk about Luke separately. So we know, like, that's not the only way we know Luke. Obviously, his name's Lucas, but Paul specifically uses things like this to distinguish between people. Like I said before, I think that I agree with Bart on this, but that's what I said at the end. Is I said I think Bart's right on this, but I could be wrong about it. Mm-hmm. But I think that is a more plausible view, and I don't want to say it's consensus because that doesn't really, like you said before, like that doesn't really matter. But like I do think that's a more plausible view to say. Now I'm saying that it may come out that you're right, but I think until we have something else that is a defeater, I would have to say that was more plausible.
But you see, I don't understand why it's more plausible, considering, like I said, considering how Paul's theology is centered around how he considers other baptized Christians. He literally says that Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. He talks about the relationship between the baptized Christian and Jesus to be a familial thing. He has that whole theology. So I'm just kind of curious, what for you distinguishes the use of just a brother in the Lord and like a blood relative? I get that Cephas and James are being distinguished here, and I totally agree with that. But when you take Paul's theology into consideration, it seems to lean more towards a fictive kinship. But I still ultimately think that the passage is ambiguous. So it's not that I think that it's definite proof that he wasn't talking about like a historical Jesus. I just think that it's too ambiguous to use for either case.
So here's what I'll say about it. Maybe I'll make a couple points. Is that so in Romans 8, right? When when he says that for those who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Obviously, that has a context, and I'm sure like we don't need to get into the theology, but like in that specific verse, there's no distinguishing between anybody. That's just a general. He's the firstborn amongst many brothers and sisters. The thing that distinguishes it for me is whenever there's a contextual usage of the term Lord's brother in reference to a specific person, and that it's pinned up contrasting that person between fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord, let's say, right? And in that way, that's what would distinguish it for me. But I would just say that I don't think that this is what I don't know you well enough to like try to psychoanalyze you or anything. But I know that Bart and other people seem to think that the only reason why some people like Price take this view and that they don't want to see that there's a distinction made here is because if it's the case that Paul knew Christ's brother, then obviously he wasn't a myth, right? So that's like kind of I don't think this is something that you can just go, okay, so Christ had a brother. Still, he wasn't a historical figure. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think this is one of the things, it's like, it overturns the apple cart. So I think it is something. Go ahead.
But I mean, I do feel like you're saying there that I just don't want it to represent it. When I've spent the last 10 or 12 minutes laying out how the context of Paul's theology coupled with the word that's actually used right there and just the grammar of the sentence in general. Like, I've given multiple reasons as to why I'm doubtful about this passage, but I don't understand how it's really warranted to say that, oh, well, you just don't want to believe that this is referencing a blood brother of Jesus. Like, that's literally so far from the actual truth that it's kind of insulting.
Okay, I can see why you took it that way, which is why I kind of prefaced what I said. Because here's the thing: when we have a model of something, and I'm looking at let's take, for example, quantum physics. There's almost 12 different there's almost a dozen interpretations of quantum physics, and some of them are completely deterministic, and some of them aren't. If somebody who's looking at somebody else's model and they go, yeah, and they go, well, I don't think that it's deterministic because of this. And then he goes, yeah, you couldn't, or it would change your entire model. Like, you have to stick in your model, right? And so, because if you did, then you would just switch to a model like mine. I don't think that it's an insult to say things like that, because you're just pointing out like that, hey, there's a paradigm shift here. It's not, and like I say, I distinguished at the beginning to say, like, I can't psychoanalyze you. I don't have a clue. Maybe you're willing to change, but I just think that, and maybe we can move on, and I'll let you say something else, and then maybe we'll move on from this point. But like, I think that whenever it does distinguish the Lord's brother in multiple passages from other brothers of Christ, right, that are mentioned as brothers in Christ and sisters in Christ as well, I think that is at least good evidence that they're using it in a specific way, even if it's just like a literary device for the purpose of distinguishing him. So, but if you want to say something else, maybe we'll move on.
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with that position. My entire position is that, yeah, he was distinguishing in them. Even when you look at the Greek and you see the ambiguity of the actual word that's being used, like, you still think that I just don't want it to be ambiguous? Well, like, I'm literally just reading the definition of the word.
Yeah, but I don't think it's actually that ambiguous. Like, the same word can have multiple days. Like, it can have multiple meanings, but still in context, like, a single usage of a word makes it, is a better fit for that word.
He doesn't use it anywhere else to show a pattern that he only uses it to refer to blood kinship. Like, all of the verses in Paul, which there's only 2 that I can think of, where adelphos is used in this way, it's all ambiguous. So I find it quite insulting that you just want to throw it up to me not wanting it to be true when I've got multiple lines of reasons that that show that I'm not being unreasonable about this. I have this view of it. While we disagree about it, I think that saying that, oh, well, you just don't want it to be true is, it's a bit disingenuous.
Yeah, but I think you're stretching it a little bit. Like, I don't think I actually said that. I think I, said something like, if this were the case, then you would have to change your entire model. It's not like you can just accept this fact and move on. That was my point. And the same thing for me. Like, well, I don't know. With me, it would be just another fact. It'd just be like, oh, well, maybe it's not talking about the Lord's brother, but there are other historical, references here. But with you, I think that would kind of upset the whole apple cart, and maybe that's just like a point in passing, and maybe it's not of any significance, because it's like, well, it doesn't matter if it would upset your theology or your view or not, if it's true or not. Like, it doesn't necessarily have any bearing on whether it's true or not. I was just saying that, like, if I accepted that it's not referring to Christ having a brother, it doesn't upset, the historical position. But with the mythicist position, I do feel like that it kind of changes the whole dynamic. And so you're admitting that, and like I say, that's what Bart said in that debate. And he just kind of said that, like, if Paul knew the Lord's brother, obviously that changes things. So,
well, yeah, it does.